All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. So welcome to this afternoon's session on the future of work, version 2.0, as I call it, the African remix. So great to have you here. Thank you for joining me. Who knows about the future of work? Is this a topic people are generally comfortable with? I guess not. Well, we are here to talk about the future of work, but I think we're gonna take a slightly different angle of it, a slightly different angle on what you might typically hear from the future of work, because based on my own experience and the work that I do in the field, we've found that over time, actually, some of the really interesting factors of what the future might look like haven't always been added to the narrative that we hear about. And one of those aspects is Africa. So we're here today to talk about predominantly about Africa, the African continent, and the influence that will have on the global economy from a future of work perspective. So a little bit about me. They call me Chale, which is a Ghanaian way of saying friend, or brother, or bro. I'm actually called Charles. That's what's on my passport, but I grew up being called Chale. I'm a Brit, a proud Brit. I'm also a proud Ghanaian. I've literally just got off the plane from Ghana today. And also I consider myself a citizen of the world. So just a little bit about my background. So I was a very early stage entrepreneur. I set up my first business when I was probably 15 or so, exited and then went to university. Studied engineering at Imperial College, so I am an engineer by nature. And then went into onto the dark side, into the world of consulting, where I joined Accenture as a management and technology consultant before finishing my career at McKinsey & Company as strategy consultant. Pretty much worked in every continent in the world, advising large organizations at CEO level and also heads of state of governments. In between that time, I did a little spell in industry as well with Tesco, where I was running aspects of supply chain, UK, China, and US. That brings us to 2013, when I left the corporate world in pursuit of ultimately my purpose. And my purpose, what I discovered was my purpose, was to find a way in which I could drive change in the world in some shape or form. And I realized that probably the best way in which I could do that would be to leave and do something on my own, right? And so for the last 8-9 years, I've been working as an entrepreneur on various different ventures with a view to drive positive change in the world. After some time, having been based in the UK and US, building businesses that would connect people to information that they didn't have privilege to, my co-founder and I decided that actually, in terms of the impact we want to make, why are we not on the African continent? And we looked at the African continent as a place where, on one hand, if you think of what we hear in the news, it's like they call it the 4Ds, death, destruction, despair, and so on. But I tell you, there's no better place on this planet where the economic, commercial story comes with an impact story to match. And that's what we found moving to the African continent. And we actually tried to make a move to Africa to see how we could add value there. And it's through that journey that we founded Move Me Back, which is one of the organizations I run today, which is currently used in 170 countries, connecting people from across the world to opportunities in Africa. We've done some cool things like launched Uber in multiple cities in Africa. So if you're in an African city and you flag an Uber, that's some of the work that we were involved in. And we've launched various other large corporates, such as Twitter, Facebook, and various others that we've been involved in on the African continent. We're also about to launch a new product called The Continent. Now, I think when you're in the UK or when you're in Europe, when people refer to the continent, it typically means that place where you find France and Germany and all those other cool places. But for those in the African sphere, the continent is often used to refer to Africa. And it's a universal term that actually brings the African continent together. And so we're launching a social professional platform because, believe it or not, we're all on LinkedIn here, I'd assume, but if you go to the African continent, you'll find that only 1% of Africa's population has a professional online digital identity. And so it's a massive opportunity to actually uncover hidden talent, which is a real challenge on the African continent. All right, so a little bit about me. So the future of work as we know it. And by the way, I'm open to taking questions as we go along. We can keep it interactive. We don't have a large room, so if you have a question as we go through, feel free to chuck your hand up. Yeah, so the future of work as we know it. This is the typical narrative that you will hear or read about whenever you search for the future of work. So, there are usually 5 main components. The one in the top left-hand side has really sort of come to bear post-COVID. This wasn't something that featured as much back in the day, but in the post-COVID world, flexibility and mobility, the idea that we're moving to a world where it's obviously not a 9 to 5, it's obviously not being based in one place. You can potentially be on a beach working in another country that's 6 or 7 hours difference in terms of time zone. So flexibility and mobility, new norms and behaviors, for prevalence of social media, new ways in which people engage, new ways in which people access information and data and so on and so forth. Basically all the things that for the older generation, when we look at, we're like, that's a little bit weird. AI and automation probably needs no real introduction. The idea that we're moving to a world where potentially human beings become jobless. But that's something that's been floated for quite some time, over a number of decades as we go through various different economic cycles. It's always believed that new technological advances will result in the loss of jobs. But what we've seen historically is that every single wave that we get, we actually create more jobs. We're yet to see what the impact of AI and automation will be. Globalization, the idea that the world is actually becoming a lot smaller than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 100 years ago. Sometimes doesn't feel like that with all of the conflict, but ultimately we have come a long way in terms of making the globe a much smaller place, where ultimately many of us are citizens of the world, as you would describe. And then you've got the aging population and millennials. So some time ago, millennials probably made up about 50% of the workforce. We're moving to a place where millennials will be 75%. But of course, the majority of the world is aging. I heard a funny stat the other day, which is in Japan, they actually sell more diapers for adults than for kids. And that's generally a trend that we see across most parts of the world, except for a few places, one of which we are talking about today. So what about Africa? Where does Africa feature in all of this? Well, we'll just start with a few stats that I like to use to set the scene around where we are with the African continent. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the map of Africa. We've got a few of the key markets highlighted: South Africa at the bottom, Ghana on the left-hand side, Nigeria, the big one in the middle, Egypt top right, and then Kenya on the right-hand side. These are some of, funny enough that most of them are English-speaking regions, but these are some of the most prolific and well-known African regions. Africa as a whole is a continent made up of 1.4 billion people. So a lot of people don't realize this, but it is actually 54 fragmented countries, some of which have populations as small as a few million, the likes of Gabon or the Gambia, which is interesting, especially when you think of Africa operating as individual countries, going to trade discussions with the likes of China. And so there's a genuine move to bring the continent together to act as one economic unit. But anyway, 1.4 billion people. For the last 10, 20 years, I would say, Africa's been one of the fastest growing regions economically. So just before COVID, things had slowed down a bit. We were actually in almost close to double-digit growth. But in terms of GDP, we're seeing 6% growth. Pre-COVID, things are a little bit choppy right now, but it is still one of the fastest and highest potential growth areas in the world. And that actually correlates with, if you look at the bottom there, 29 trillion potential in terms of GDP. So Africa's GDP right now is about 2 to 3 trillion, which is similar to what we have in the UK. But when you look at it as an economic region, when you look at the number of people in the market, and when you look at the trajectory that it's on, getting to 29 million or 30 million in the next couple of decades, it's actually not unrealistic at all. In fact, some would say that's a conservative estimate. So very, very significant growth potential. But I think what characterizes Africa a lot these days are those two figures in row 3 and 4. Number one being the age. So we said the whole world is aging, but Africa is actually getting younger, right? So the average age of the average African is 19 years. Yeah, so just think about that for a moment. 19 years of age. And it is fast growing in the sense that by 2100, we're going from 1.4 billion people to 4 billion people. So very, very significant growth. So as we start to think about the future of work, you can already start to see some of the numbers that are going to drive this thing, whether we like it or not. The rest of the world is generally shrinking and getting older. Africa is getting younger and growing. So something to be very mindful of. When we think of Africans as individuals in the market, they also, I would say, very much embody the trends that we see in many other parts of the world. So firstly, distribution, the idea of Web3 and the fact that we're moving to a world that's more distributed. Well, generally, Africa has always been a distributed type of market. It's not very centralized. You find that governments and public sector do play quite a significant role within markets, but other than that, there's not a significantly strong sort of organizational or corporate pulse that drives activity within the market. So generally distributed markets, which is what we're seeing in many other parts of the world. It's informal, so it varies per country, but the lion's share of workers within African continents are informal workers, meaning that they could be doing many different things on any given week for reasons of survival or reasons of maintaining their quality of life. They're poly workers. So this little snapshot on the side, actually this is just a screenshot from a couple of days ago. So I was in Ghana. Sadly, my dad's not doing too well, and I was with some medical professionals and some of the most renowned within the region. And as part of their treatment or their service, I needed a physiotherapist. They gave me the contact number of this individual, Eben Mensah, who's apparently one of the better known physiotherapists within the market. When I went on his WhatsApp, and WhatsApp's a massively used tool within all of Africa, as you can see, the services he provides are photography and videography and graphic design alongside, it is the right person, alongside physiotherapy. This is a very common theme that you see within Africa. Yeah. Community and trust-based. So a lot of what happens on the African continent is based on trust. We're seeing a move towards that again in Western markets. So for example, when people are looking for roles, let's say, again, in a place like Ghana, where my parents are from, if you are looking for someone for a job, actually one of the best places that you can find them would be at church or at a funeral. And that's usually based on the fact that within those communities, you have very strong knowledge of who individuals are, and it's one of the best ways to vouch for individuals. So if there's anything that I want you to go away with thinking that really underscores this journey that we're on, it is the fact that by 2050, 40% of the world's young workforce, ultimately the driving force behind economic activity in the world, will be African. Yeah. And if you really think about that for a moment, that's 40%. It's a very, very significant number. So it is very difficult to separate Africa from the future of work when we think about it from a global perspective. So let's look into kind of the history of this a little bit. I think Africa's got a bit of a point to prove. So if you look at the last sort of 100 years or more, even more, we have generally been used to seeing waves of industrial development across the world. We started with Industry 1.0, which was all about mechanization. A lot of that started within the UK. Then we moved on to mass production, automation and computers and electronics. And then we're kind of in 4.0, what they call the fourth industrial revolution, very quickly moving into the fifth industrial revolution, which is all about cyber, physical systems, the Internet of Things networks. When we think of the fifth industrial revolution, that's all about mass customization, which is still developing as we speak. But when we look at Africa's role or Africa's existence within these different economic cycles or revolutions, as we call them, it's very much missed out on each one, right? And on the right-hand side there, I just kind of score Africa's performance as we see it. So a lot of sort of 1.0 started with agriculture, right? And the industrialization of agriculture. I would say even today, Africa probably scores a C in terms of where it is today in terms of its agriculture output, which is still very much smallholder farmers, low volume outputs. We've never really got that right. Manufacturing. We've seen the likes of China, India grow, after they developed agriculture, grow their economies through mass market manufacturing and being able to export that out to the rest of the world. Through many various different challenges, such as infrastructure, Africa hasn't got there yet. And it's actually believed that it will never get there, especially because of the way markets are moving and the idea that in many cases, you see what we call leapfrogging, where industries are moving so quickly that you have markets that end up skipping what is typically seen as the common way in which economies develop. So for example, Africa is an example of a place which has pretty strong internet penetration right now. However, you will not find broadband or cabled broadband in most places in Africa. It's all mobile and wireless based. Yeah. And so for that reason, you're probably going to see technologies such as 5G adopted far quicker in Africa than in many parts of the West. Yeah. Electronics, again, limited capability both in terms of infrastructure, but also skill set to participate in Industry 3.0, which was the electronic components phase. And then finally, the internet. Up until recently, Africa has very much been lagging behind as well in the internet race for a number of reasons. One, access to affordable devices. You can almost say the desktop computer era completely passed the African continent by. Access to telecoms infrastructure, again, a lack of cabled telecoms connectivity, and we've moved very much to wireless. And then cost of internet access, so data and subscriptions have all been challenges for the African continent, but that is changing. And we will touch on that very quickly. But just before we go on, just to sort of complete this narrative around the challenges that Africa has had on every dimension you look at, I would say Africa has struggled. Yeah. So here are some of the stats that I would say characterize the market today. Now, depending on your lens, these are massive, massive opportunities. In fact, there are many entrepreneurs within the market that are looking to solve for these things right now. For example, the 66% unbanked is probably one of the biggest opportunities that exists today in the African market, and everybody is looking at it, including Western investors, which we'll touch upon in a second. So 66% of the African population are unbanked, or the adult population. Still got 500 million without electricity. And you start to think of when electric access is provided, what does that also mean for the market, and what does it mean for consumption? What does it mean for GDP? Massive opportunity there. And then just to give some sort of context, average annual income, 600 million. That's not quite right. It's $600 rather than 600 million. That would be something. 70 million young kids are still out of school. Again, in the technology and information age, massive opportunity there. There's a real talent challenge. We have this, what we call the missing middle in Africa a lot of the time. You find that there's usually a lot that exists at the bottom end and a lot that exists at the high end, but there's always stuff missing in the middle. To put it in context, the hotel that I was staying at, in Ghana whilst I was away, I happened to see Tony Blair hopping out of a room. And those hotel rooms are somewhere in the region of $400 a day and can compete with anything you'll find in the Western market. However, if you go down to the sort of normal 4-star, 5-star space within the African continent, you'll find that there's just a gap of both volume and a gap of quality. So Africa is very much a place of extremes, very low end and very high end. And just to round off, 1/3 of young people are unemployed. So those young people figures that we've spoken about, again, real opportunity for for young people to find opportunities that they can contribute to the African economy, but also the global economy. Yeah. So that was the story of the past. But it's changing. And it's changing rapidly, and it was changing rapidly pre-2020, but COVID, like in many other parts of the world, has accelerated that drive. If we use internet connectivity as a proxy for what is happening across the market, you can see here that in 2020, we had 500 million mobile subscribers in Africa, which is quite a significant number when you actually think about it. That's forecast to reach 615 million over the next few years, which will represent about a 50% penetration rate within the market. Equally with mobile internet, and when you think of the various different services which will be provided over the next decade or so, 474 million internet users. Currently only about 10-15% of those are on 4G. The majority of the market is still very much on 3G, but we are seeing again rapid movement towards 4G and 5G over the next 10-15 years or so. That represents around a 40% penetration rate in terms of mobile usage. And then smartphone adoption, very much thanks to Android and some of the cheaper Chinese handsets that flood the African market. We're looking at around 64% of penetration for smartphone users in the African market. 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of. 5 years ago, that would have been unheard of. So you can already start to see that you've got this huge, whether it's from a talent point of view, whether it's from a consumer point of view, you've got this huge movement and injection of an uncatered for group that fundamentally has the potential to transform the way that we, wherever we are sitting on the globe, think of the economic outcomes over the next 15, 20 years or so. And this is, for those of you who follow popular culture, this is translating into what we see on a global basis. So, quick pop quiz. First picture on the left. Anybody know who those two gentlemen are? Oh, we've got someone at the back. I'm guessing you're African. Any non-Africans know who those two gentlemen are? All right, off you go. All right, Wizkid and Burna Boy, who I would say right now, probably two of the hottest African exports from an entertainment perspective. Now, they're actually at the O2 in London, which I believe Wizkid sold out for 4 nights in a row, which again reflects the power that African culture is having across the rest of the world. In fact, the category of music that they operate in, which is called Afrobeats, has time and time again hit the top of the charts, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the US. This wouldn't have been possible without the technological revolution that we're seeing. You know, many of these guys grew up on the African continent, and their sound, their creativity has been exported over social networks and reached people in various parts of the world. Yeah. In the middle there, we've got Lupita, who I think is a little bit more well-known. Again, Kenyan African actress, who is very much a brand ambassador for Africa. And then we have Kabi here, who, again, for TikTok users and many in the room, I'm sure if you have children, they'll know who he is. One of the most followed individuals on TikTok, a Senegalese African. What this highlights is the shift that we're seeing already, and usually you see these shifts in the cultural spaces before you see them in business areas, but the shifts you're seeing of 3 individuals who are very much at the top of their game from a global perspective, and all of that has happened through technological revolution. If we dig deeper into what's happening and where the trends are, what you'll find is over the last 5-6 years, there's been a massive turn of fortunes in the African startup space. So we've already started seeing the development of innovation centers that are emerging across the key hubs of Africa, which, again, 10 years ago, pretty much were non-existent. We've just had another record-breaking year in terms of VC inflows into the African continent. So you've got Nigeria there, which is one of the most populous, or the most populous country in Africa, currently around 160, 170 million in population, forecast to reach 400 million over the next couple of decades, so bigger than the US before long, which is attracting a lot of external funding. So we reached 1.5 billion last year in terms of funding from VCs. That's likely to be smashed again this year. In fact, in the first 7 weeks of 2023, I think we've already hit 1 billion. So if you extrapolate out, 2022. So if you extrapolate out, that will give you a sense of the pace of growth. Yeah, so Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Ghana, that's where we're seeing most of the significant activity. And so 4.4 billion, I think, was last year's figure. And that's up almost 150% on the previous year. Please.
You pointed out earlier, those are mostly the English-speaking department. Is there a language divide issue?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, is there a language divide issue? These are predominantly English-speaking countries. There is actually a slide on languages, which we'll come to, but Africa generally, in fact, let me jump to it real quick.
Does the money simply go where people speak English?
That has been a trend, but it's changing. Yeah. So you'll see here the main business languages which are spoken on the African continent. Most of them reflect the legacy of colonization. So you've got North Africa above the Sahara, which is predominantly Muslim, Arabic speaking. You've got quite a few English-speaking countries. It's not the best of keys for color, so apologies for that. But a lot of English-speaking countries. In fact, you can see here the top 10 English-speaking countries in Africa. But a very strong French Francophone contingent. And I think what you tend to find in Africa is various different nationalities will interact more with the countries that they were colonized by. So for example, the Francophone-speaking countries, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Mali, often transact more with France. And you're seeing that the French markets and French VC is hot on the tails of English VC. It's just a little, maybe I'd say 3 or 4 years behind in terms of where it is. Yeah, but many would argue that most of the big opportunities are actually in French-speaking Africa. But what it's worth realizing is, in terms of the actual population, you tend to find that actually the English-speaking countries are the bigger populations within Africa. Of course, you've got Nigeria, which is a big center. Egypt is an anomaly, although English is a key business language in Egypt, but Egypt is an Arabic-speaking country, which sort of bucks the trend of all of these being English-focused countries. But again, to the point, the language barrier is a real problem actually for trade on the African continent. So you often will find, for example, Ghana, which sits on the western coast, neighbors Ivory Coast, which is a French-speaking country. In terms of trade and also in terms of movement of people and flights, etc., you actually find that those are constrained usually as a result of the fact that they don't speak the same language. Yeah. So sometimes it's actually easier or faster to fly from, say, Ghana, or more flexible Ghana to London, and then over to Paris and back down to Côte d'Ivoire, even though they share a border. Yeah. Great question. All right, so just going back to this slide. The emergence of innovation centers, these are the biggest by number, but there are also other places where this is growing. And you can see a little bit of what I described earlier here. So if you see the blue line there, that represents 2021, 4.4 billion that was raised last year. That compares with 2020, which was also a record-breaking year, which was 1.7 billion. In fact, between 2019 and 2020, in terms of the year-on-year growth, Africa was one of the best performing regions in terms of growth of VC capital. And so when you look at 2020 to 2021 and how big the jump is there, that's even more significant. Yeah. So this trajectory is something that I think everybody should be aware of. And you can see there, the timeline from left to right almost shows how quickly these milestones are being hit. Yeah. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but in 2019, I think Africa had one unicorn. And for those who don't know the lingo, unicorn represents a startup organization that reaches a 1 billion in valuation, one unicorn. Today we're at 8 over a short space. So we went through a period of however many years, decades of not getting to an African unicorn, and now there are 8 in a very short space of time. Yeah. All right. So it's not just about VC money that's flowing in, but we're also seeing tech hubs and tech ecosystems. So a lot of people are usually surprised to hear that there are 650, actually, in fact, that's probably a lot bigger than that, what you would call tech hubs and tech centers in the likes of the countries that we've seen previously. So South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. Kigali is an interesting one. Kigali is Rwanda. Kigali is a very, very small market, but is often held up as a market of best practice for many other African nations. So for example, in Kigali, you can register a business faster than most places in the West. Yeah, and we're seeing the emergence of many of these countries that are innovating in ways that are actually preceding what we find in other parts of the developed world. Yeah. So just a few examples of key investors in the space. In fact, Y Combinator, is everyone familiar with Y Combinator, YC? Yeah. YC, very, very prolific in Africa right now. I think in their last cohort, they must have had somewhere in the region of 12 or 13 Nigerian companies. Yeah, so we've seen the likes of Paystack, which was acquired by Stripe. So Paystack was a Nigerian payments company, received a little bit of seed funding from Stripe very early on. They grew and executed very well within the market and were recently acquired, I think, for about 200 million or so. And we're seeing many of those unicorns have gone through YC. And generally, we're seeing a disproportionate amount of funding going to YC companies. Yeah. If memory serves me correct, there are somewhere in the region of about 80 YC companies in Africa. Yeah, so it's quite a significant number. A lot of people are not aware of how much is going on in that space. Yeah. All right. We also got various incubators and accelerators. Add to that list Google, who this year launched quite a significant seed fund for the African continent. But there are many players in the space now. Yeah. And here are some of sort of organizations that are based there. So you've got the usual suspects, the tech giants, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Netflix, Uber, IBM, MasterCard, Visa, and many, many more who are entering at a great speed of knots. And then African-built organization. Many of these are some of the unicorns that we mentioned. So Jumia is an example. That was, I think, the first startup to register on the New York Stock Exchange. So they reached unicorn. They were the first company to reach unicorn status. I think they're still kind of floating around unicorn status, but Jumia is the example of the Amazon for Africa. And it's actually a great case study because I think Jumia is a great example of where understanding that the African context is that little bit more challenging, that little bit more different. In many cases, you can't lift models that work perfectly in other parts of the world and just replicate them in Africa. It requires customization for the local market, and something we'll touch upon again later. But many of these that you can see here are mainly fintechs. Fintech is very much the charging industry at the moment on the African continent. Yeah? But across the board, education, transport, energy. These are all of the, if we go back to the slide that I had earlier when we were talking about all the challenges within the African continent, we're finding more and more that it's not public sector that are solving for these, it's startups and very much the private sector. Another thing to be aware of, when you start thinking about the influence that Africa will have on the on the global market, especially given infrastructure is improving, connectivity is improving, access to energy is improving, talent is more accessible, is time zone. I very much grew up in an era where much of whether it was technological development or whether it was call centers were outsourced to the likes of the Far East or India. And there was always a challenge. At my time at Accenture, we were always working with the likes of Manila and Bangalore, and time difference was always a challenge, especially for those in the US. what's really interesting as Africa develops is if you look at the African time zone, or the time zone that Africa sits in, it very much aligns with Europe and the UK, right? In terms of doing business remotely, in terms of working with a separate market, you could say that Africa is actually a perfect region for that. And I think for that reason, we are going to see significant, once infrastructure stabilizes and levels out, we're going to see significant activity and collaboration that happens between the Western markets and the African market. Yeah, it's more pronounced from the US. Again, if you think of East Coast US, which is -5, and then all the way through to Pacific time, the likes of San Francisco, California. Again, you could argue makes more sense for outsourcing to happen with the African continent. Yeah, so something to bear in mind there. Physical location. We've just covered language, but for many of the African countries, if we take England, for example, we take the English. For many of the African countries which are English speaking, the quality of English speaking is very, very high. In many cases, if you spent time in schools in, say, let's say Ghana or Nigeria, you will find English speaking and English written language higher than standards you would find in the UK. Yeah. Much of English speaking Africa curriculum is based on traditional or older British curriculums. So again, language is not necessarily a barrier for English speaking. Similarly, you find the same with French and Francophone speaking countries. So again, presents massive opportunity for how collaboration is going to happen between these countries. What we've seen in the past is the biggest barrier to this collaboration happening has been infrastructure. And that's what's changing, that's what's been improved. So something to bear in mind and something to consider as over the next few years, but in your line of work and what you're doing, you are very likely, especially given cost considerations and talent constraints, to find yourself working with these markets. Yeah. Let's think about cost for a moment. This is just a bit of a rough comparison, just to help you understand or put things in context. We've got two measures here. We've got some average monthly salaries, and then we have how much it costs to take an Uber in those regions. Yeah. So we've got the UK, US, India for comparison, and then Ghana as a proxy for African countries. You'll see the average salary of the salary for an average African is $150 a month, compared with the UK $4,000. So when you start to think about the cost of talent, and really in the area of tech, where it's very easy to argue that actually you don't see with training, with time and with training, you actually don't see any significant differences at all between the quality of talent and their ability to execute and their ability to perform at the highest levels. It's a far cheaper market to operate in, similar to what we saw in India, but with far more favorable conditions, especially given location and language. Yeah. Similarly, Uber, a proxy for cost of living within a market, even though you could argue that Uber is not as mature in the likes of Ghana, but $5 for, let's say, a 10-kilometer ride compared with maybe $40 or $60 in the UK and the US. Yeah. So again, puts it in context. When you start to think of costs of teams, costs of operations, you could set yourself up in Ghana, which is what we're seeing with the likes of Twitter, the likes of Google, who rather than hire remote talent are actually basing themselves in these regions and building teams and training them from the ground up. Yeah. Andela is an example of an African startup which actually received quite significant funding from Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg specifically. One of the first startups to create a model that trains talent in emerging markets and then outsources them to Western markets as developers. And they did a study of, as they grew their operation, they started operating in more and more markets, including Western ones. They did a study and they found that actually of all of the different regions they operated in, including the UK, the US, and various other parts of Europe, when they benchmarked all of their developers, the Nigerian developers were far stronger than those in other markets. And that's from a region that's actually coming from a lower base, where traditionally computer science has not been part of curriculums or has not been a favored route in which people follow. So you're actually finding a lot of talent that are translating and moving across into the tech field, but through additional training as opposed to as paths that they followed in their degrees. And we spoke about big tech. Big tech previously, when you think of the likes of Facebook and Google, many of their initiatives almost felt a little bit aid-like. Their not-for-profit arms or their development arms. But over the last few years, you're seeing far more strategic moves from all of the big organizations. So for example, Google only this month announced that it's setting up its first product development center in Nairobi. Usually what we've seen is some of the engineering work gets outsourced, but in terms of products being developed, in terms of products being defined, that usually happens in Western markets. That's changing now. They also set up an AI research lab in Ghana, and that's a region that's growing very significantly. So again, when you think of the future of work and you think of where some of these innovations are going to come from, I think a lot of people will not assume that this is going to come from the likes of the African continent. Microsoft following suit in Kenya. We've seen Twitter. They're trying to launch their first office in Ghana as well. And Facebook have been on the African continent for quite some time. South Africa, East Africa, West Africa. Yeah. Much of their work started as policy. So working with African governments to make sure that Facebook remains accessible, or Meta, should I say. But now we've seen a shift towards more and more sales personnel, because as the markets grow, selling more into corporates, selling more of our advertising services, but of course also building teams that are actually building and executing within the market. So how will this affect you? I think the first thing to recognize is there's a big opportunity here. Yeah. I think there's an opportunity, depending on what your disposition is to be part of the next 100 unicorns, which I think over the next 5 years or so, we're going to see more and more unicorns disproportionately coming out of the African region than anywhere else in the world. To give you a sense of how that compares with what we've seen in other places, I was actually involved in 2010 when I was at McKinsey with number 10 in their strategy of how we would develop the UK into the Silicon Valley equivalent. And that's where a number of policies such as SCIS and the entrepreneurship visa came out. And back then, we had somewhere in the region of 8 unicorns. That figure is, even that 100 is out of date. That figure is probably somewhere closer to, I would say, the 150 mark. So these things move very, very quickly. As I mentioned earlier, Africa currently has 8 unicorns. That was 1 in 2019. Yeah? China currently has 162. India is following suit with 100. Again, that number's slightly out of date. So when you look at trends, when you look at these patterns, which are always usually very consistent, it tells you that there's a massive opportunity that exists in the African continent. Yeah? So for those who are thinking about this from an economic point of view or an individual economic point of view, there's massive, massive opportunity to get involved in the next generation of startups that potentially could shape the world, both from an impact point of view, but also economically. Yeah? And the likes of YC being involved makes these types of organizations very accessible. As an example, through Move Me Back, we placed one of the first engineers of Monzo into an East African startup who are doing remittances across the globe. Again, another YC company who's now the CTO of this organization that is has a base in the UK, has a base in the US, but is serving the African market, making it easier for individuals to send money back and forth from the African continent. So opportunity is something that you should think about in terms of how you can proactively, or how this could proactively affect you. But there are many other ways. I think you will find over the next few years that your teams will become more and more diverse through basic economic and also looking for talent perspectives. So, as the African market comes more and more online, we've already spoken about the levels of unemployment that exist in the market. You have to think, if the population in Africa, you've got somewhere in the region of, I'd say, 35 million people joining the African workforce every single year. What are they going to do? We're seeing more and more that tech is the output, or is the outlet, because again, it's becoming clear that manufacturing is not going to be the answer for how the African continent develops. Yeah, so tech and the creative sectors. So something to bear in mind, that your teams are very likely to have an influx of African talent, and in fact, that's something that you can drive. Your own individual contracts, where are they going to come from? I mean, your next gig could be on the African continent. There's fundamentally a challenge when it comes to more senior expertise, a challenge for in the skills gap area. So generally found that in Africa, for example, in Ghana, again, using that as an example, 50% of the tertiary skilled are typically outside of the country. So you've had this effect for many years, which they call the brain drain, which is those who are most skilled often leave the market and go to other parts of the world where they feel they can earn more. That is changing with some of the trends we're seeing in remote work, where people may still be working outside of the country, but they're still based within country. But something to consider, that your next gig may come from the African continent. I think what's more exciting for me is the last two, consumers and innovation. We've seen the numbers, we've seen where the growth is. The next generation of consumers are going to be on the African continent. We said we're looking at almost 4 billion people in this century. These are the people that your products will be catering to. Yeah, your customer is no longer going to be on your doorstep in this sort of connected world. And what that means is there's a completely different type of consumer with a completely different set of behaviors and realities that you're going to have to get to know, right? And your organizations are going to have to get to know, that the world generally are going to have to get to know. This is something that I think will become more and more prominent over the next 5-10 years or so. So something to potentially get a head start on. And of course, innovation. There are many, many examples that we see of innovation coming out of Africa and being adopted in the West. So when you look at the likes of mobile money and various innovations that we're seeing in our banking sector, many of those were prolific in the Africa sector 5-10 years beforehand. Yeah, the common example that everybody cites is M-Pesa, which was one of the first mobile money setups in East Africa, in Kenya. Yeah. Similarly, zipline delivery of critical items through drones. We're seeing that happen again in East Africa before it's been replicated in other areas with the likes of Amazon, etc. So innovation and the centers of innovation are more likely to come from places like the African continent, where you're solving for a different set of challenges. But many of those challenges, in many cases, play an almost forward-looking role as to what we're going to experience in other parts of the world. Yeah. All right. Reasons why you might want to be proactive about this. So when we survey people who are working in the African continent, many say that they find work there far more fulfilling. That's subjective, but we definitely see a trend there. Growth, I've just been talking about the opportunity that exists, but it is an economy that is moving very quickly. It's an economy that's getting younger, and it's an economy that's growing, both in terms of economics, but also in terms of people. Yeah. When it comes to talent within the African organization, I think that's probably one of its biggest untapped qualities. So the challenge within the African continent is a lot of people don't have the typical CV like we do. So I put my CV up there. Many people would recognize Imperial College, maybe McKinsey, maybe Accenture. If you don't recognize all of them, there's a likelihood that you'll recognize one of them, and you can put me in a box in some shape or form. The challenge with the African continent is even if people have.
Attention please, attention please. A fire has been reported within the building. Please leave the building immediately by the nearest exit.